Welcome to Georgetown University's discussion with Charles Freeman on the prospects for trade negotiations in the Biden administration. This event is co-sponsored by the Georgetown Asian Studies Program and the Institute for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues. Participants can send questions to uschinadialogue@georgetown.edu. Today, I'm James Green, a senior fellow at Georgetown. Thanks for joining us. Good evening, good morning. Today, we are fortunate to have Charles Freeman, who is a senior vice president at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and he will be joining us to talk about the future of trade with U.S. and China. Charles has spent a career working in and on China, including as assistant USTR for China, including working in the Senate, and including working in many corporate capacities. He has his law degree from Boston University and an undergraduate degree from Tufts University. He studied Mandarin in Taipei and in Shanghai. There's a lot to chew on over the last week or two. Welcome, Charles. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to start with the diplomatic outreach in Anchorage last week between Secretary of State Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, their erstwhile Chinese counterparts, to ask what you make of where diplomacy is in this Biden administration. And then from there, we'll get to the more specific issues of trade.
Well, thank you, James, and good morning. And thanks to Georgetown for inviting me today. I'm just up the street from the campus, so I can pretty much lean out my door and wave to Georgetown. So it's anyway, it's good to see you virtually. Yeah, no, I think of what the initial kind of muscular positioning by both the Biden team and by the Chinese, I think for the cameras largely, was not surprising. I think to me anyway. I think the Biden administration recognizes that the one truly bipartisan issue in Washington right now is frustration and fear of China. So I think that Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan had to present a pretty antagonistic veneer for the Chinese side and for the cameras, and likewise, I think Yang Jiechi has a history of speaking out in these kinds of events, and defending Chinese core interests with a bit of a wolf warrior style. So I wasn't particularly surprised, but I think, by and large, it reports of the private meetings between the four of them, the 2+2, were much less kind of imbued with the political grandstanding and much more not just cordial, but practical and focused on areas of apparent concord. So I think there's I think message sent from both sides, and I think ultimately now that the goal from the Biden team is to have a practical and productive relationship with the Chinese.
And Charles, we did a podcast, you and I, on this topic of diplomatic discussions, and I appreciate that. I wonder if you could just step back a little bit before we get to the National People's Congress and other things about moving forward, and just describe, in your experience, why you think having that level of private discussion is helpful in advancing U.S. interests. I mean, you had mentioned the kind of public display that Tiger Yang showed, and our side, the U.S. side, did as well. What's the utility of the private discussion in your mind?
Well, I think one has to have a genuine channel for discussion uh, and to just an ability diplomatically to reach and have a productive exchange. It's rough when you're just kind of throwing bombs over the walls. And so I think to make sure that you do have that kind of productive exchange is important, and not just for reasons of diplomatic nicety or to avoid surprises, which I think we're all quite nervous about in the relationship, but also for practical reasons of global concern. Climate change isn't going to be managed without the U.S. and Chinese at least kind of agreeing tacitly on a way forward. And global health issues require some coordination. As long as if we are going to return to the kind of mass travel back and forth across borders that we did. And there are other reasons to have a decent relationship with the Chinese.
And on that, I think I just saw that John Kerry, the climate envoy, and Xie Jinhua are setting up a meeting, and so that, to your point, Charles, is moving ahead. I wonder if I could get to something on domestic U.S. legislation, and then talk a little bit about the National People's Congress and how both of those might impact the discussion broadly on economics and trade. You worked in the Senate for Senator Murkowski, the other Senator Murkowski. I wanted to ask, there's been press reporting about how Senator Schumer, the majority leader, wants to move ahead with a package of China legislation. There are some companion bills in the House. Mostly these are issues to advance U.S. technological investment and competitiveness. How do you see that kind of, can you handicap how that's going to go in the Senate and the House, and how that might then lead to, once those things are in place, if they pass, what the Biden administration might or might not do with China?
Sure. No, and look, I think a lot of the China bills that are, quote, run faster, unquote, bills, like the Endless Frontier Act and others that are coming out, which are aimed at injecting a significant amount of public funding into innovation and the making sure that U.S. technology keeps pace or surpasses Chinese levels of technological advancement in key foundational areas. And I'm not sure. Well, we'll see if at the end of the day Congress still feels like writing the $1 trillion checks that it's been writing, and which is something that will be required to quote run faster in the views of senators that support and congressmen that support that agenda. But a lot of that is, it's just China is the catalyst or the rationale for stuff that we've been putting off for a long time, and including infrastructure investments and other things. So I guess if China is the thing that finally gets us to do what we should have been doing, then fair enough, as long as you don't run it, you don't continue to evoke the kind of ethnic negatives that the Trump administration did, for example, in the process, which I think we can all see has been terribly damaging here at home.
Right. And I wonder if you could just reflect before moving to the National People's Congress on your time working in the Senate then versus now, and what you sense has changed or what's changed. I mean, I think I've never worked on Capitol Hill, but my sense is that it's not the same place that it was, say, 15, 20 years ago. How do you see things today? And then what does that say about these sort of China bills? Or does it not say anything, given, as you said, the bipartisan agreement about wanting to move forward on a lot of these things?
Well, yeah, no, there was, back in my day, the Senate was, it was known as the world's greatest deliberative body. And while there was not, there was not the kind of deliberation on the floor that would lead to sea changes, there was a lot of ability and room to compromise. I remember on the Senate Finance Committee, which was chaired, by Senator Moynihan on the Democratic side and Senator Roth on the Republican side. You had everybody, the staff all met together, Republican and Democrat. It was very much how are we going to approach this issue on trade or otherwise, whether that was PNTR for China or otherwise. Now that's really changed. There's just very little work across the aisle. So how does that impact the China bill as well? As you said, as we said, the bipartisan nature of the China bills make it possible to do a lot of things in the name of competition with China or rivalry with China. So one hopes that one would have hoped that things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership could have been swept in under that rubric, although using too much China bashing with the goal of passing legislation is, it can be a bit dangerous, honestly.
Wow. So I didn't realize Senator Roth was a Republican from Delaware. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
So back at a time when you could actually be a Republican from Delaware.
Yeah, there were a few the old style Republicans back then. There were a few
Rockefeller Republicans, sort of made
Republicans, Mayor Lindsay Republican. Yeah, there were people, genuine fiscal conservatives, social, liberals, and that kind of thing.
Well, speaking of people that aren't Republican, so the National People's Congress wrapped up, or the two sessions wrapped up a couple of weeks ago. I think Bill Bishop from Cynicism said it was the most boring premier's press conference in the history of these things. And I have to say, it is one of the few times that the Chinese leadership has to face the Western press is the premier's press conference at the end of the National People's Congress. And historically, there have been times in which there's a somewhat real discussion. I remember Wen Jiabao was asked about the Tiananmen Square crackdown, and Zhu Rongji certainly had his share of addressing serious questions from Western reporters. And not so much this time. Putting his performance aside, how do you assess where the Chinese government is on its plans that came out in the National People's Congress, both the 14th five-year plan, the broad economic ones, but then also kind of politically where the leadership sees itself?
Well, I think they're pretty confident, despite everything and despite the many challenges that are inherent in the Chinese economy. I think the leadership is feeling very, very confident about its future and the future direction of both the party and the country. So I think you saw some of that in the attitude of Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi. This is a China that Yang Jiechi said is not gonna take that crud from the Americans. So I think look, I mean there are many of us that would say the party has really reversed a lot of the economic reforms that really had drove the Chinese miracle, and now they're turning around and putting checks on the private companies and all that. Yeah, that is not a recipe for long-term economic success in my view, but we'll see.
I want to get to some of the non-economic things, some of the sanctions that were recently announced, and kind of how that wraps up with what might be economic discussions between the two countries. But I'm curious if you, for our viewers, can talk through what the dual circulation strategy is on the economy and what we should know about, just broadly speaking, at a 50,000-foot level, where the Chinese leadership wants to take the domestic economy. How do you see where that's happening in Beijing?
Yeah, no, look, I think there's an effort to use consumption to drive the economy, and I think that's certainly happening in large measure, but also the effort to co-opt private, particularly technology companies, to be the development arm of the People's Liberation Army and the defense look, that China is developing its own military industrial complex. They've kind of gone about it a little differently than we did. And I know there's not necessarily equivalencies that we want to invoke here, but the effort to the civil military fusion effort, I think, is something that is a genuine concern for businesses, like the members of the chamber that are looking to partner with Chinese companies. It's certainly going to drive the debate here in the U.S. In about engagement and about decoupling into different areas.
I think one of the things that is most challenging for companies to navigate when you speak of decoupling and engagement is what's happening in Hong Kong, and the National People's Congress over the last basically 12, well, I guess 10 months, because the previous National People's Congress was delayed by 2 months. The Chinese leadership has decided that Hong Kong is going to change what it is and how things operate. I guess I just wonder, from your perch, how do you see that foreign companies are navigating that changing environment in Hong Kong, and what are you hearing from your members, or what's the kind of atmospherics that you can share about how American companies see Hong Kong and see their Hong Kong operations these days?
Well, look, I think there are multiple views of what's happening in Hong Kong. A lot of U.S. companies are headquartered in Hong Kong or based in Hong Kong because it's a relatively easy place to live, but they're there for the Chinese market, and they've got significant or enormous operations in China. And living in a more, quote, Chinese city isn't going to really disrupt their operations that much. Except perhaps, they're faced with the conundrum of closed internets and that kind of thing. For others, they're in Hong Kong because of convenience, because they do have a lot of they source out of China, the mainland, and being in Hong Kong is easy, but it's expensive there, right? So if you don't have to be there, if the convenience is suddenly overridden by problems of rule of law and less convenience, you move elsewhere. And then finally, there are the companies that the reason they're there is Hong Kong's rule of law and the certainty that's involved therewith, and whether they're financial services companies or otherwise. I think they have to think carefully about where they're headquartered, and is Hong Kong that secure a place for the work they're doing.
I wonder if I could move from Hong Kong to Xinjiang-related sanctions that the U.S. and the EU and the U.K. and Canada announced yesterday, I guess, and the Chinese government responded by sanctioning 10 European persons and 4 entities. Is that right?
Yeah.
And this is for the initial sanctions from the US and the EU and the UK and Canada were for activities in Xinjiang, and they were actually quite modest in number. That is a handful of people that have been involved in running the Bingtuan or the security apparatus in Xinjiang. But how do you think that and the Chinese response will or won't impact kind of broader discussions that the US has with China, but even the EU, right? The end of last year, the European Union and China agreed in principle to an investment agreement that's now before the European Parliament. How do you kind of assess where kind of these sanctions fit in or don't fit in with that the other kind of broader negotiations on trade and investment?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. As you said, I thought the U.S. And other European and Canadian sanctions were pretty limited and measured. The individuals and their families from Xinjiang was not. They were not particularly robust. Let me just say it. The Chinese, on the other hand, were quite pointed and when you actually name a couple of members, 2 or 3 from the European Parliament, when the CAI is coming up for a vote, the Chinese investment deal was not a sure thing in the European Parliament. And now, naming and shaming several European Parliament members, it's going to be very difficult for other members to take that lying down and vote for the agreement. So I think it's in trouble. Europe has been in a slightly different place, obviously, well, not just slightly, but has been in a different place than the United States with respect to China, and still have been of the mood that they can reach an accommodation that allows for significant economic integration on both sides, without the kind of overlays on export controls or investment screening that the United States seems to be going to. We'll see if that changes in the wake of these actions.
Yeah, one of the institutes that was sanctioned is the Mercator Institute that wrote an incredibly good report on Made in China 2025 about a year and change before the U.S. Chamber wrote its very good report. So, I mean, this is significant, I think, brain power in the European context for understanding China. Yeah. And it even if you don't necessarily agree with all the analysis, and there's a wide range of folks at Mercator that have different views, it just seems to be kind of punitive and mean to go after that sort of institution. I wonder if on the investment agreement, if you think the foreign ministry or the Chinese leadership miscalculated on where things were, or maybe they didn't care that much about the substance of the agreement anyway. How do you understand what those decisions were?
I can't speak to Chinese decision making with respect to what they think they're signaling and not signaling. But I think the Chinese right now are of the opinion that we're doing okay and the world needs us more than we need the world. So I think that is clouding their calculations a bit. That sense of, I don't know whether it's hubris or justified confidence, but it's certainly clouding their public policy making.
I wanted to move to some international institutions, and in some ways the Trump administration exposed the weaknesses of institutions and norms and what works and what doesn't. I think the Section 301 tariffs on Chinese imports into the United States, in particular over forced technology transfer, which was outside the World Trade Organization rules, is a particular challenge for the WTO, but then more broadly for international institutions. Katherine Tai was confirmed just last week from the Senate, and already had her first, telephone discussion with the new Director General of the WTO in Geneva. How do you see prospects for U.S.-China discussion on international institutions? I would say in this case, particularly trade and economic related ones. I'll just throw another acronym out there, the ILO, the International Labour Organization. I've seen some calls for them to get more involved in activities in Xinjiang. Is there some role for them? And then there's always the UN Human Rights Commission and other kind of world bodies. How do you assess kind of how these international organizations are doing? And then on the specifics, is that an opening for discussion between Beijing and Washington, or rather, will that drive a further wedge between the two countries?
No, it's a really fundamental question, James. I mean, there's no question but that some of these international institutions, including the WTO, is in serious need of reform. Not just the membership has changed since the last big WTO set of reforms, but the world has changed. So I think it's high time that some of the issues are looked at. The United States has to look at things like the subsidies, the agreement on subsidies, and say, well, this really isn't working, but do we want to impose our own subsidies? And so, do we want to ignore the subsidies chapter of the WTO? So there are a lot of things that have to go into the thinking about this. I'm not sure that the U.S. Effort to be more under the Biden administration to engage in a more plurilateral and multilateral way is necessarily good news for U.S.-China cooperation in multilateral fora. I just think that there is a sense that efforts by the Chinese to influence the direction of those fora and to provide alternatives to those forums, whether it's through the Belt and Road Initiative as an alternative to the World Bank or what may be. I think there's a lot of angst that's built up about China's role in the world and China's role in these institutions, given that the sense that the United States had 15, 20 years ago that there was increasing convergence between Chinese norms and U.S. style norms and multilateral norms. I think that there has been significant divergence, and so finding ways to use the multilateral institutions to overcome that, I think, is a bridge too far.
One of the issues I'd love to get your views on, or just really an explanation for our viewers, is what the appellate body is of the WTO and why it's such a sticking point. And I raise it because even in the Obama administration, USTR at that time had issues with the way the appellate body was working or was not working. And without getting into too much name calling and spit throwing, could you just kind of frame why this issue is important and why it will be kind of difficult to untangle, even if, as you say, the Biden team is more focused on a plurilateral or multilateral approach?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the appellate body, which is the kind of the ultimate deciding body, or essentially the ultimate deciding body for disputes. The folks that were named to the appellate body, there was, and I think justifiably, some question about inherent biases and that kind of thing. So it really was not a fair system in terms of looking for the kind of certainty and outcomes from trade disputes that you'd want to see, no matter which party you're from, just as Americans or other WTO members. The results that you're getting were not necessarily consistent and not good jurisprudence. So I think there was definitely a need to reform the appellate body, whether or not it required the United States to essentially blow up the WTO is another question, but I think that's clearly what's happened.
Right. I wonder if we could move to the prospects for some sort of trade discussion. I think we've seen at the foreign policy side that Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan had their kind of first meeting. Catherine Tai has just started. Gina Raimondo has started at Commerce. Janet Yellen is over at Treasury. So the principals, the senior people are in place on the Biden team. I mean, it's clear that their focus on the economic side was the Recovery Act and domestic legislation. I've mentioned the China legislation in the Senate. So, and there's also the pandemic, so that limits the natural kind of interaction between countries. But once these people get in and their deputies get confirmed, what do you see as the parameters for an economic discussion between the United States and China? And what would you kind of say would be the rough timeline for that unfolding in, again, rough sketches?
I mean, look, and from the perspective of the U.S. business community, what we'd love to see is the Biden administration focus on for lack of a better word, the Trump phase one deal, the U.S.-China economic agreement of January 2020, which has very specific timelines and a very specific set of outcomes to which the Chinese agreed. Focus on getting complete compliance with that agreement, and then push for a phase two, which deals with the kind of structural issues in the Chinese economy that not only U.S. companies would like to see addressed, so that there is more fairness as they compete in China, but also I think from the perspective of Chinese companies, probably those reforms make sense as well. That said, that's what the hope is. I worry a couple things. In part, Katherine Tai said in her congressional testimony, or in response to a question at her nomination hearings or confirmation hearings, that when asked about phase one, sort of was pretty lukewarm in the endorsement, saying it's that's the deal we have right now, but kind of brushed off the idea of future negotiations as being look, we've got a lot of history there, is what she said. And I think that points out kind of the crossroads at which we're at. At the time of WTO, when we were negotiating with China to join WTO, and after China joined the WTO, there was a sense, and I think borne out by everything that the Chinese leadership was saying, and I think actually, I'm not going to dispute that it was genuine. There really was an effort to put in place market-based reforms that would be very convergent with U.S. economic reforms, so that the United States and China would have much more kind of in common on economic policy issues and trade issues than not. And so the goal was, between the United States and China for years, was to focus on keeping China's pedal to the floor on economic reform, to continue that convergence. Somewhere along the line, the definition of reform changed, for China, and reform has much more become about improving the ability to regulate from the Chinese side, without attention to the structural issues in the economy that the United States and the U.S. business community is anxious and interested in seeing. So there's really been that divergence again. So the question is, if you're going to negotiate with China, and there's been this sense, that those negotiations have been relatively fruitless, then you're questioning what the point is, and I see that. Let me just say that even at a time when the United States side was becoming frustrated with the Chinese for kind of the failure to make major moves, there were incremental things that were very valuable to U.S. business interests. that the Chinese were doing. So, having those discussions, as frustrating as they may have been to both sides, because there was that kind of talking past each other about where the respective parties wanted the Chinese economy to go. There have been undeniable market openings that have been good for the U.S. economic interests, including chamber membership. So we'd like to see those conversations continue. Even if they're taken with a slightly different kind of chapeau for both sides.
Thanks. Yeah, I completely agree on the overuse of the word reform, so much so that it's lost its meaning. It's not a linguistic thing; it's a meaning thing. I think Jude Blanchett, who's now at CSIS, but when he was at in Beijing, he came up with the best term that I've seen to describe it, which is re-form, to basically reform. And he described it as like taking clay and like remolding it a little bit. And I think that's kind of where it is. It's not really reform in the way that we think of it. There is some cognitive dissonance, interestingly, in my view, on the Chinese side, in which Chinese elites, some of them really believe that 改革开放 is still going forward, and the terms are still being used. And I think some of them earnestly believe that it's actually happening, that the Chinese economy is continuing to reform in the same way it did in the 90s and parts of the early 2000s. And they either are unwilling to or don't want to see that actually that era of reform is behind us. On the kind of dialogue structure and how you make that work, and there have been benefits, you're right. Obviously, if you don't have someplace to push, say, biotech approvals, well, then U.S. traits, for example, for a new corn or new wheat won't get approved, and then U.S. farmers won't be able to plant the newest crop, and then that stuff won't get sold to China. And so, if you don't have some mechanism to say, "Hey, it would be really helpful if this modest regulatory change came into focus, or there was a bit more transparency on how these decisions are made," then if you don't have any place to do that, then we're kind of stuck in some stasis, and that the stasis is not great for market access for a lot of U.S. products and services. And so I think that's the reality of trying to do that. I wonder, going back to the Biden team's approach on talking to Europeans and Japanese, certainly something that Ambassador Lighthizer did at USTR when he was the trade representative. It was overshadowed clearly by tariffs on China, but how do you see the likelihood of success on using that kind of plurilateral approach to address, say, subsidies, which you brought up, or other sorts of market access or technology standard sorts of issues? What's the likelihood that that's going to actually turn to something fruitful for, say, your members? That is, oh, hey, yeah, the US and EU and Japan agreed on this, and therefore this is what's going to change on the ground in China.
I think it's going to be a lot harder for the Biden administration to reach the kind of concord with particularly Europeans, but also the Japanese and others, on China. And I think that there's Southeast Asia and the rest of Asia as well, that they want to kind of draw into a multilateral conversation about China. The Europeans, as we said, are have been in a little different place from the United States over China, but then there are also lots of conflicts between Europe and the United States on trade issues and issues of privacy, and there's a real fundamental lack of trust between the Europeans and the Americans right now. In part because of recent events, but I think if you're the Europeans and you look at the United States political situation now, you're thinking, okay, well, so Biden's in the seat now, and he's pushing for an internationalist agenda. Great. 2024 is right around the corner. We'll see if this is an ongoing process. So I think there's some, I think, justified caution on the part of the Europeans and Japanese on kind of the long-term direction of the United States with respect to China strategy or any strategy. But from the business perspective, I think a plurilateral game is the only game in town, really. And so I think we want to support efforts that are designed to create or to reinforce a global set of common rules and common approaches to things on digital trade, on a variety of other standards issues that are friendly to U.S. corporate interests, right? So I think that's what we'd like to see. I think it's a longer road than probably the Biden administration realized up front, although they may understand that now.
I wonder, you're right to mention Asia and the broader context of how the rest of the region sees China and sees the US-China relationship.
Yeah.
I think most countries in the region don't want to be in the position of having to choose between Beijing and Washington.
Sure.
And I think that's a mistake to put them in that position. But I wonder if on the kind of economic and trade related things, as you mentioned, for companies, they want to be able to operate as seamlessly as possible among as many number of markets as possible to lower their costs and be able to reach customers and expand their operations. How do you see that kind of regional integration with the conclusion of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the end of last year, which is ASEAN +5, I guess, without India? Talk about a renewed China, Korea, Japan free trade agreement. The region is not kind of sitting around waiting for America to come back to the TPP. How do you see that kind of regional dynamic and then overlaying that, the kind of US-China relationship there?
Well, it's easy to sit in Washington and to poo-poo the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, as being kind of trade agreement light, in the sense that the terms of the agreement are not particularly exacting. It's a friendly agreement. It doesn't move the needle that much on trade. But what it does do is it creates an architecture for some sort of collaborative work between governments on issues of trade. And that architecture, because of its membership, will probably be a pretty polite venue. So I'm not sure that you'll see huge conflicts resolved through the RCEP. But the fact that that's going on, that the Chinese are outreaching to the Koreans and the Japanese again, that the Chinese really are being much, at least in rhetorically being much more open and multilateral in their approach than the United States has shown a capacity for of late. It's one aspect of the competition. So
I wonder, as we're coming up on our time, if I could ask you to step back. You've lived in China and in Asia, and you studied there for the last 40 years. Some people have said US-China relations are at their lowest point since normalization in 1979. I wonder how you see it, kind of big picture, as a final question. And then the follow-on question is, does it matter, how we feel that where US-China relations are, or is that really kind of immaterial to what has to be done?
That's a really great question. I haven't thought of that before. Does it really matter? Things are pretty low right now. Are they lower than pre-1972? Probably not. I mean, we did not have a relationship to speak of, except one that was based on hostility. So they're not at their lowest point. They may be at their lowest point since '79, but that's in part because the United States is getting used to a China that is very different from the China that we saw in 1979 or even in 2001. And the Chinese are starting to feel their oats and feel their role in the world, and that there's no question that conflict is, if not inevitable, is certainly likely. And I think there's lots for the United States to be concerned about in China. The what's going on in Hong Kong, what's going on in Xinjiang really does deserve some attention from the United States and from the world. Chinese efforts at establishing military perimeters really do require some thought from the United States and others. So there is a rethinking of the relationship, which was nicely encapsulated in the National Defense Strategy a few years ago. I think that's where we are. We are in a state of competition and rivalry, and it's going to drive U.S. policy for a considerable amount of time. So,
Charles, always great to talk. Enjoy the cherry blossoms
Thank
for
you.
the 2 weeks that it exists in Washington. I'm James Green, a senior fellow at Georgetown University, and appreciate your time, Charles. It's great to see you.
Thanks, James. Take care.